They said his hands were too dirty to touch greatness, but 30 minutes later, the most powerful people in the room would realize they had just insulted a living legend. The crystal chandeliers above the Sterling Arts Foundation ballroom shimmered like frozen stars, scattering warm light across polished marble floors and rows of perfectly dressed guests. Waiters moved silently between round tables dressed in white linen, while a string quartet filled the air with elegant harmony. Every smile looked practiced. Every handshake carried the weight of money, influence, or reputation. At the center of it all stood Nathaniel Sterling, a white billionaire whose name had become synonymous with luxury, philanthropy, and cultural prestige. Tonight was his annual charity gala, an event attended by CEOs, senators, renowned musicians, and several distinguished public figures. Nothing could go wrong. At least, that was what everyone believed. Just beyond the spotlight, moving almost invisibly along the edge of the ballroom, an elderly black janitor guided his mop across the marble floor with slow, careful precision. His name was Elias Brooks. At 67 years old, his silver hair framed a peaceful face marked by quiet dignity rather than age alone. A pair of dark glasses covered eyes that had not seen the world in nearly 2 decades, yet every step he took seemed guided by memory instead of sight. He knew every hallway, every doorway, every change in the polished stone beneath his shoes. He could tell where he stood simply by the echo of footsteps and the scent of polished oak mixed with fresh flowers. Few people noticed him, and that was perfectly fine with Elias. Invisible people often heard the truth others missed. As the evening unfolded, guests drifted toward the centerpiece of the ballroom, a magnificent black Steinway grand piano positioned beneath a single golden spotlight. Its polished surface reflected the glittering ceiling above like a calm midnight lake. Elias paused several feet away, setting his cleaning cart beside a marble column. He gently reached one hand toward the edge of the instrument, his fingertips stopping just short of the smooth lacquer. It wasn't ownership that guided his movement. It was respect, almost like greeting an old friend after many years apart. Before his fingers could rest on the piano, a sharp voice sliced through the music. "What do you think you're doing?" Conversation stopped almost instantly. Nathaniel Sterling strode forward, his expensive Italian shoes clicking confidently against the marble floor. His expression hardened the moment he saw the janitor standing near the piano. Several guests turned, curious about the interruption. Cameras from local media quietly shifted toward the unfolding scene. Nathaniel glanced at the cleaning cart, then at the worn work gloves hanging from Elias's pocket. His lips tightened into a look of unmistakable disapproval. "Dirty hands don't belong on this piano," he said loudly enough for half the ballroom to hear. A few uncomfortable chuckles escaped from nearby guests while others simply watched in silence. Elias lowered his hand immediately. His shoulders remained relaxed, his voice calm. "I meant no harm, sir." But Nathaniel was already motioning for event staff to escort the janitor farther from the stage. Around them, the ballroom grew strangely still, as though even the music itself had begun holding its breath, waiting for something no one there could possibly imagine. The quiet returned only on the surface. Beneath the polished elegance of the ballroom, something had shifted. Elias Brooks stepped back without protest, resting one weathered hand lightly against the handle of his cleaning cart. His face revealed no anger, no embarrassment, only the calm patience of a man who had learned long ago that dignity never needed to raise its voice. He quietly turned away from the piano and continued polishing the marble near the east entrance as conversations slowly resumed behind him. To most of the guests, he had already disappeared again. That was how evenings like this usually worked. People remembered the spotlight, never the hands that made the room shine before anyone arrived. Elias understood that better than anyone. Nearly every evening for the past 4 years, he had walked these same halls after sunset, arriving just before 6 o'clock. With a neatly packed lunch, a fresh pair of work gloves, and the same gentle greeting for every employee he passed. The security guards always smiled when they heard his familiar footsteps. The kitchen staff quietly saved him a cup of warm coffee before the gala crowds filled the building. The young maintenance workers often asked him for advice, not because he spoke often, but because when he did, every sentence carried the weight of experience instead of pride. No one had ever heard him complain about his blindness. When new employees apologized for forgetting to move a chair or leaving a card in the hallway, Elias simply smiled and said, "The world is full of obstacles. We just learned different ways to find our path." Few people knew anything about the years before he became a janitor. Whenever someone politely asked what he had done before losing his sight, Elias always answered with the same simple words. "I played a little music once." Then he would change the subject. No stories, no achievements, no names, just quiet gratitude for another day of honest work. Across the ballroom, Nathaniel Sterling had already returned to greeting influential donors, laughing comfortably beneath the warm glow of crystal chandeliers as though the awkward interruption had never happened. His assistants moved from table to table, making certain every detail reflected perfection. Tonight's gala was expected to raise more than $20 million for music education initiatives across the country, and dozens of reporters continued recording every important moment. Reputation meant everything here. Every photograph, every speech, every carefully chosen word helped reinforce the image Nathaniel had spent decades building. Then, almost without warning, that perfect rhythm cracked. A stage manager hurried through the side entrance, his normally composed face pale beneath the bright lights. He leaned close to the event director, whispering something that immediately erased her confident smile. Within seconds, she was speaking urgently into her headset, while two production assistants rushed backstage. The string quartet gradually lowered their instruments, uncertain whether to continue. Guests exchanged puzzled glances as the elegant music faded into uneasy silence. Nathaniel noticed the sudden confusion and walked briskly toward the stage. "What is happening?" he asked, keeping his voice controlled despite the growing tension around him. The event director swallowed hard before answering. "Sir, there has been an emergency. Maestro Leonard Hayes became seriously ill on his way here. His physician will not allow him to perform tonight." Nathaniel stared at her without speaking. The headline performer, the internationally celebrated pianist whose name alone had attracted donors from across the nation, would not be walking onto that stage. The magnificent Steinway now stood alone beneath its golden spotlight, untouched, waiting in complete silence while hundreds of distinguished guests began wondering whether the evening they had traveled across the country to witness was about to unravel before their eyes. The silence spread faster than panic. Conversations dissolved into whispers as guests checked their watches, glanced toward the empty stage, and quietly wondered whether they had flown hundreds or even thousands of miles only to watch the evening collapse. Television crews adjusted their cameras, hoping to capture whatever happened next. Nathaniel Sterling forced a confident smile as he climbed the steps to the stage. Years of public appearances had taught him how to hide uncertainty behind polished composure, but inside, his thoughts raced. Canceling the performance would embarrass the foundation, disappoint major donors, and dominate tomorrow's headlines for all the wrong reasons. He leaned toward the event director once more. "Call every pianist in the city," he said quietly. "Offer whatever it takes. We have 30 minutes. She nodded and hurried away with her phone already pressed against her ear. Minutes passed. One call became 5. 5 became 12. Every answer sounded the same. Some performers were out of state. Others were already on stage elsewhere. A few admitted they could never prepare Maestro Leonard Hayes' demanding program without weeks of rehearsal. Nathaniel looked toward the grand piano standing alone beneath its warm spotlight. The beautiful instrument suddenly felt less like the centerpiece of celebration and more like a reminder that perfection was slipping beyond his reach. Near the back of the ballroom, Elias Brooks quietly continued folding freshly polished linen cloths into his cleaning cart. Although he could not see the anxious expressions filling the room, he heard everything. Shoes moved faster across the marble. Voices dropped into hurried whispers. Cell phones vibrated almost constantly. Stress had its own sound, and after decades of listening to people instead of looking at them, Elias recognized it immediately. One of the younger maintenance workers approached him with a worried sigh. "Looks like the concert might be over before it starts," the young man said. Elias tilted his head slightly. "The pianist is not coming?" "Medical emergency," the employee replied. "Everyone is searching for a replacement, but nobody can play that program on such short notice." Elias remained quiet for several seconds. His fingertips rested lightly against the smooth wooden handle of his cart. Somewhere beyond the murmuring crowd, The Steinway waited in complete stillness. Even from across the ballroom, he could almost feel its familiar presence. Every piano carried its own voice long before a single note was played. Finally, Elias spoke so softly that only the young maintenance worker could hear. "I remember that concerto." The young man blinked, unsure he had heard correctly. "You do?" Elias smiled gently. "It has been many years, but music stays where eyesight cannot reach." The maintenance worker stared at him for a long moment before letting out a nervous laugh. "Mr. Brooks, this is the biggest charity concert of the year." "I know," Elias answered with complete sincerity. "That is why the music should not be silent." Before the young employee could respond, another announcement echoed through the ballroom. The event director stepped onto the stage, her expression carefully controlled despite the disappointment in her voice. "Ladies and gentlemen, we appreciate your patience while we work through an unexpected situation." A restless murmur swept across the audience. Several guests quietly stood, collecting their jackets. A prominent donor whispered that perhaps it was time to leave before the evening became awkward. Nathaniel watched the movement from the side of the stage, feeling the event slipping away one table at a time. Then, from somewhere behind the gathering crowd, a calm voice rose above the uncertainty without demanding attention. "If you will allow me," Elias said with quiet respect, "I believe I can keep the music alive tonight." Every nearby conversation stopped. Even those preparing to leave slowly turned toward the elderly blind janitor whose hands still carried the faint scent of furniture polish instead of applause. For several long seconds, no one moved. The words hung in the air with the quiet weight of something too unexpected to dismiss and too improbable to believe. Guests exchanged puzzled looks before a few uncertain laughs drifted through the ballroom. Someone near the front whispered, "The janitor?" Another guest shook his head with a polite smile, assuming the elderly man was simply trying to ease the tension. Nathaniel Sterling slowly turned toward Elias, disbelief settling across his face. "This is not the time for jokes," he said, keeping his voice measured for the sake of the audience. Elias remained perfectly still, his hands resting lightly against the handle of his cleaning cart. "I was not making one, sir," he replied. "I only wished to help." The ballroom fell quiet once again. Nathaniel studied the elderly man for a moment, searching for any sign of arrogance or desperation. He found neither. There was only calm certainty. Somehow that unsettled him even more. The event director stepped closer and lowered her voice. "We cannot seriously consider this." Nathaniel nodded almost immediately. "We cannot risk humiliating the foundation in front of our donors." Elias heard every word but showed no reaction. He simply inclined his head with quiet respect. "I understand your concern," he said softly. "If you believe I cannot play, I will return to my work." He gently reached for his mop, prepared to disappear back into the shadows without another word. Then an elderly woman seated near the front slowly stood. She had attended nearly every gala for the past decade and was known as one of the foundation's earliest supporters. "May I ask him one question?" she said. Nathaniel hesitated before giving a reluctant nod. She looked toward Elias. "What piece did Maestro Hayes intend to perform tonight?" Without a pause, Elias answered, "Rachmaninoff Piano Concerto No. 2 in C minor, followed by an encore of amazing grace arranged in the style of a traditional spiritual." A ripple of surprise moved through the audience. The program had never been announced publicly. The elderly donor blinked in curiosity. "How did you know?" Elias smiled faintly. "I heard the rehearsal yesterday afternoon while polishing the balcony railings." Several musicians seated among the guests exchanged thoughtful glances. One violinist quietly leaned toward another and whispered, "That is not the sort of answer someone invents." Nathaniel folded his arms, unwilling to surrender his judgment so easily. "Listening is very different from performing." Elias nodded. "Yes, sir. It always has been." Another uncomfortable silence settled over the ballroom. The conductor, who had remained quietly beside the stage throughout the exchange, finally stepped forward. He had spent more than 40 years working with concert pianists across the world, and experience had taught him to recognize confidence that came from skill instead of ego. "Mr. Brooks," he said carefully, "if you truly remember the concerto, tell me how the opening begins after the orchestra enters." Elias did not rush his answer. His fingers lightly tapped against the wooden handle of the cleaning cart, almost as though invisible piano keys rested beneath them. Then, in a calm voice barely above a whisper, he described the opening passage note by note, explaining not only the melody but the subtle tempo change Maestro Hayes had always preferred during live performances. The conductor's eyes widened. He looked down in thoughtful silence before lifting his gaze toward Nathaniel. Only someone who has studied this music deeply would know that detail. Nathaniel felt every camera in the room turning toward him. The choice was no longer simple. Refuse the old janitor, and the gala would almost certainly end in disappointment. Accept his offer, and the reputation he had spent decades protecting would rest in the hands of the very man he had dismissed only minutes earlier. Under the warm glow of the ballroom lights, with hundreds of expectant faces waiting for his decision, Nathaniel slowly looked toward the silent Steinway, then back to Elias Brooks, and for the first time that evening, certainty abandoned him. The conductor drew a slow breath before looking directly at Nathaniel Sterling. "We have two choices," he said quietly. "We cancel the concert, or we give him 60 seconds. The ballroom became so still that the faint hum of the air conditioning seemed unusually loud. Nathaniel glanced across the sea of elegant faces waiting for his answer. Some donors looked skeptical. Others appeared quietly curious. Every camera remained fixed on him. He had built his reputation by making difficult decisions under pressure, yet this one felt strangely different. It was no longer about money or prestige. It was about trust, and the only person asking for it was the man he had dismissed less than 15 minutes earlier. Finally, Nathaniel spoke. 1 minute. That is all. A soft murmur spread through the ballroom. The conductor nodded and walked toward Elias. "Mr. Brooks," he said respectfully, "would you join me?" Elias smiled gently. "Thank you." He removed his work gloves with careful hands and folded them neatly on top of his cleaning cart. Then he straightened the collar of his simple gray uniform, brushing away a trace of dust from his sleeve as though preparing for an ordinary evening rather than the most extraordinary moment of his life. Every step toward the stage was slow and measured. He did not need anyone to guide him. His polished black shoes moved confidently across the marble floor, counting distance through memory and sound. The audience watched in complete silence. Many had never truly looked at him before tonight. Now every eye followed him. Reaching the edge of the stage, Elias paused for only a moment before climbing the short staircase with steady confidence. The conductor quietly pulled out the piano bench. "The keyboard is directly in front of you," he whispered. Elias smiled again. "I remember where a piano waits." A few guests exchanged surprised glances at the quiet reply. Nathaniel remained standing near the front row with his arms folded tightly across his chest. Although his expression stayed controlled, uncertainty continued to grow beneath the surface. He wanted this impossible idea to fail quickly so the evening could move on. Yet something about the old man's calmness refused to fit the image he had created only minutes earlier. There was no trembling, no nervousness, no desire to prove anyone wrong. Only peace. Elias slowly reached forward until his fingertips rested on the smooth edge of the Steinway. He did not touch the keys immediately. Instead, he let one hand glide gently across the polished wood, almost like greeting an old friend after years apart. A faint smile crossed his face. "Still beautiful," he whispered so softly that only the conductor heard him. The conductor stepped back without speaking. Elias lowered himself onto the bench with practiced ease. His posture changed almost instantly. The quiet janitor seemed to disappear, replaced by someone whose every movement carried natural discipline refined over countless hours. His shoulders relaxed. His breathing became slow and even. His hands floated just above the keyboard without pressing a single note. The ballroom remained completely silent. No glasses clinked. No whispers lingered. Even the photographers hesitated to press their shutters, afraid to disturb the fragile stillness filling the room. Nathaniel noticed something unexpected. The conductor had unconsciously straightened his jacket and was standing with the same respectful posture he usually reserved for world-renowned soloists. Several musicians in the audience leaned forward in their seats, their expressions no longer skeptical but intensely focused. They were not looking at a janitor anymore. They were watching a man who seemed to belong exactly where he was sitting. Then Elias slowly lowered his hands until every fingertip rested lightly upon the ivory keys, and before a single note had been played, an unexplainable feeling settled over the ballroom, as though the piano itself had been waiting years for this exact moment. The first note rose so gently that many people wondered if they had imagined it. It did not demand attention. It invited it. The rich voice of the Steinway drifted through the ballroom like warm light spilling across still water, soft at first, then deeper with every passing measure. Elias Brooks never hurried. His fingers moved across the keyboard with effortless precision, each phrase flowing naturally into the next, as though the instrument had been waiting all evening for someone who truly understood its language. The conductor lifted his hands almost instinctively, guiding the small chamber orchestra into the opening passage. One by one, the musicians joined him without hesitation. Within moments, uncertainty vanished. They were no longer accompanying a substitute. They were following a master. Nathaniel Sterling stood motionless near the front row, his folded arms slowly falling to his sides. He watched the elderly man with growing disbelief. Nothing about this performance resembled luck. Every entrance was perfectly timed. Every pause carried intention. Every crescendo seemed to breathe before it expanded through the hall with quiet confidence. Around the ballroom, conversations disappeared completely. Guests who had reached for their coats quietly sat back down. Reporters lowered their phones, forgetting to record as they simply listened. One woman pressed a linen napkin gently against the corner of her eye without realizing she had begun to cry. An elderly veteran seated near the center closed his eyes and smiled faintly, transported somewhere far beyond the ballroom. Even the waitstaff stopped moving, holding serving trays perfectly still so that nothing would interrupt the music filling the room. Elias remained completely unaware of the hundreds of eyes watching him. He did not play for applause. He did not play to prove anyone wrong. He played with the quiet honesty of someone who believed music belonged to every heart willing to receive it. Years of silence seemed to dissolve into every note. Joy and sorrow, hope and gratitude, loss and forgiveness flowed together until they became impossible to separate. The melody no longer felt like a performance. It felt like a conversation that had waited decades to be heard. The warm glow from the crystal chandeliers reflected across the polished lid of the Steinway, surrounding Elias in soft golden light. His face remained peaceful, almost radiant, as though he could see something beyond the reach of ordinary sight. His breathing never changed. His shoulders never tightened. Every movement carried the calm confidence of lifelong discipline. The conductor glanced toward the first violinist, whose expression revealed complete astonishment. Without speaking, both understood the same impossible truth. This level of artistry could not be improvised. It had been shaped over thousands of hours, countless concert halls, and a lifetime devoted to excellence. Nathaniel felt an unfamiliar heaviness settle in his chest. He replayed his own words from earlier that evening, hearing them now with painful clarity. They sounded smaller with every beautiful phrase rising from the piano. He had judged a pair of working hands without ever wondering what those hands had accomplished before they picked up a mop. Across the ballroom, several distinguished guests quietly exchanged puzzled glances. Something about the old man's style felt strangely familiar. His interpretation of Rachmaninoff carried a signature elegance that a few older music lovers believed they had heard many years before, though none dared speak the thought aloud. As the final movement approached, the music expanded with breathtaking warmth before settling into a single sustained chord that seemed to linger in the air long after the keys had fallen silent. No one applauded. No one even breathed loudly. The silence that followed was deeper than sound itself, until a chair slowly slid backward near the front of the ballroom, and someone stood with quiet purpose, staring at Elias Brooks as though they had just recognized a face the world should never have forgotten. The man who had risen from the front row did not clap. He removed his reading glasses slowly, as though needing to make absolutely certain that his eyes had not deceived him. His silver hair caught the warm light from the chandeliers as he took one careful step toward the stage, then another. Two Secret Service agents standing several feet away immediately noticed his movement and quietly followed at a respectful distance. The audience watched in complete silence, sensing that something far greater than an extraordinary performance was about to unfold. Nathaniel Sterling frowned, uncertain why the distinguished guest had suddenly left his seat. The conductor remained perfectly still, almost afraid to disturb the moment. The elderly gentleman stopped only a few feet from the piano and looked directly at Elias Brooks. His voice, though softened by age, carried clearly through the silent ballroom. "Mr. Brooks," he said gently, "I wondered if I would ever hear those hands again." Elias slowly lifted his head. A faint smile appeared on his face before he quietly answered, "Good evening, Mr. President." A collective gasp swept through the ballroom. Nathaniel's eyes widened. Several reporters instinctively raised their cameras again. The former president smiled warmly and extended both hands toward Elias. "It has been far too many years, my friend." Elias accepted the greeting with quiet humility. Time moves faster than music sometimes. The former president laughed softly before turning toward the stunned audience. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said, "I do not believe many of you realize who has been sitting at this piano tonight." Every person in the ballroom leaned forward. Even the waitstaff remained frozen where they stood. Before his accident took his eyesight, Elias Brooks performed private concerts at the White House for my administration and for 2 presidents before me. Whenever our nation faced difficult days, this remarkable man reminded us that hope could still be heard, even when it could not yet be seen. A wave of astonishment moved across the room. Several older guests exchanged looks of sudden recognition. One distinguished music critic quietly whispered, "That cannot be possible." Another replied almost immediately, "I remember those recordings. They were never released to the public." The former president continued, "After losing his vision, Mr. Brooks declined every public honor we offered. He told us that titles fade, applause fades, but serving people with humility never loses its purpose." Nathaniel felt the blood drain from his face. Every assumption he had made only minutes earlier now collapsed beneath the weight of the truth. He remembered the cleaning cart, the work gloves, the words he had spoken in front of everyone. Dirty hands. Those same hands had once performed inside the most historic residence in the nation. Those same hands had comforted presidents during moments of uncertainty. The realization settled over him with painful clarity. He had not merely underestimated a janitor. He had failed to recognize the quiet greatness standing directly in front of him. The former president looked back at Elias with genuine affection. "I searched for you for years," he said. Elias smiled peacefully. "I found another way to serve. Every building deserves to shine before people enter it. Every person deserves kindness before they are noticed." No one spoke. The simplicity of those words carried more weight than any speech delivered that evening. The conductor slowly lowered his head in respect. One violinist discreetly wiped away tears. Nathaniel remained rooted to the floor, unable to escape the truth that echoed far louder than the applause that finally began rising throughout the ballroom. It started with a single pair of hands, then another, until every person in the room stood together, not honoring a performance alone, but honoring the extraordinary man they had failed to truly see. Nathaniel Sterling stood without moving even after the applause filled every corner of the ballroom. The sound surrounded him, yet he heard almost none of it. His own words echoed far louder inside his mind. He looked toward Elias Brooks, who remained seated at the piano with the same quiet humility he had shown while polishing marble floors only an hour earlier. Nothing about the old man had changed. Only the way everyone else saw him had. Nathaniel slowly walked toward the stage. The confident stride that had defined him throughout the evening had disappeared, replaced by measured steps that carried the weight of honest reflection. Hundreds of eyes followed him, but for the first time in years, he paid no attention to cameras, headlines, or reputation. He stopped beside the piano and remained silent for several long seconds. Finally, he spoke. "Mr. Brooks, before everyone here, I owe you an apology." The ballroom became completely still once more. Nathaniel lowered his head. "I looked at your uniform before I considered your character. I judged your hands before I wondered about your story. I believed status could tell me who deserved respect, and tonight you showed me how wrong I was." No one interrupted. There was nothing to add. Every sentence sounded sincere because it carried none of the polished perfection people had expected from a billionaire. Elias listened quietly before offering a gentle smile. "Thank you for saying that." Nathaniel looked surprised by the simplicity of the response. "You are not angry." Elias rested one hand lightly upon the closed piano lid. "Anger is heavy. I carried enough of it after I lost my eyesight. One day, I realized forgiveness travels much farther." Those words settled over the audience with remarkable softness. The former president smiled quietly, watching the exchange unfold exactly as he might have expected from the man he had admired for so many years. Nathaniel reached into the inside pocket of his jacket and removed a folded envelope bearing the foundation's gold seal. He held it carefully before speaking again. Our foundation has an opening for artistic director. I cannot imagine anyone more deserving. If you would accept, I would be honored to have you lead every concert we host from this day forward. A hopeful murmur spread through the audience. Many nodded in agreement. It seemed like the perfect ending. Elias gently shook his head. That is a generous offer, but I cannot accept it. Surprise crossed Nathaniel's face. May I ask why? Elias smiled warmly. Because I already have meaningful work. He reached for the pair of neatly folded work gloves resting beside the piano bench. Every morning I greet people who never notice. Me. Every evening I leave this building cleaner than I found it. There is dignity in that, just as there is dignity in playing music. One job is not greater than the other unless pride convinces us it is. Several employees standing quietly near the ballroom entrance lowered their heads, deeply moved by his words. The young maintenance worker who had spoken with Elias earlier smiled through misty eyes. Nathaniel slowly nodded, understanding something that years of wealth had never taught him. Respect was never earned by titles alone. It was earned by the quiet way a person treated others, especially those the world too often overlooked. He extended his hand. Elias accepted it with a firm, steady grip, and this time Nathaniel noticed nothing except the kindness carried within those hard-working hands. The following morning, the Sterling Arts Foundation looked exactly as it always had. The marble floors reflected the early sunlight pouring through the towering glass windows. Fresh flowers filled the lobby with the gentle scent of lilies and white roses. Employees arrived carrying coffee cups and briefcases, preparing for another ordinary workday. Yet nothing truly felt ordinary anymore. One by one, staff members slowed their pace as they entered the main hall. There, beside the same polished cleaning cart, stood Elias Brooks. He wore the same neatly pressed gray uniform, the same comfortable black shoes, and the same quiet smile. Without ceremony, he guided his mop across the marble floor with patient, practiced movements. Nothing about his appearance suggested the extraordinary story the nation had awakened to. Overnight, every major news outlet had shared photographs from the gala. Headlines celebrated the forgotten pianist whose humility had touched millions of hearts. Television commentators praised his grace. Music schools requested interviews. Concert halls offered lifetime honors. Invitations arrived faster than anyone could count. Elias accepted none of them. Instead, he reported for work at exactly 6 o'clock, just as he always had. Nathaniel Sterling arrived unusually early that morning. He walked through the front entrance without assistance, without photographers, and without announcing himself. For a moment, he simply watched Elias working quietly beneath the soft morning light. Then he crossed the lobby and gently took the mop handle. Elias smiled before speaking. Good morning, Mr. Sterling. Nathaniel smiled back. Good morning, Elias. There was no awkwardness left between them, only mutual respect. Nathaniel carefully held the mop while Elias adjusted the bucket beside him. Several employees stopped in surprise as they watched the billionaire willingly assist the man he had once overlooked. No speeches were given. None were needed. Actions carried enough truth on their own. Before returning to his office, Nathaniel quietly placed a small brass plaque beside the entrance to the concert hall. It contained only one sentence. Greatness is never measured by the clothes a person wears, but by the character they carry. Beneath those words appeared a second line in smaller letters. Dedicated to Elias Brooks, whose music reminded us to see with the heart before judging with the eyes. Visitors often paused to read the inscription, but many never realized the man polishing the nearby floor was the same person whose name appeared on the plaque. Elias preferred it that way. Every afternoon, children attending music workshops passed through the hallway. Sometimes they recognized him from the news. Sometimes they simply smiled because he always greeted them first. He answered every question with patience, encouraged every young musician with kindness, and reminded them that talent mattered far less than compassion. The notes you play may fill a room, he would often say, but the way you treat people can fill a lifetime. Months later, the Foundation's annual gala returned. This time, the evening opened not with a famous soloist, but with a moment of silence. Nathaniel welcomed every guest with a different message than the one he once believed. Tonight, he said, we celebrate music, but even more importantly, we celebrate the dignity that lives inside every person, whether they stand beneath a spotlight or quietly prepare the room before anyone arrives. As applause gently filled the hall, Elias stood near the back, listening with peaceful gratitude. He had never needed the world to know his name. He had only hoped the world might one day learn to look beyond appearances. And as warm light settled across the polished floor where quiet footsteps echoed once more, it became clear that the greatest performance of his life had never been played on a piano at all. It had been written through humility, forgiveness, and the simple courage to remain kind in a world that too often judged before it truly saw.